Welcome, world language teachers. We are here to learn more about how to use even more target language in our classrooms. I'm here with Angie, the one and only, who is famous for how well she uses target language in her classroom. Angie, can you tell us a little bit more about your classroom experience and how you got so good at using target language?
Well, I taught for 31 years. I think I actually went out the gate speaking a little too much of the target language because I had done so much research about how one learns a language. And I had to tone it down in level one so that I could make it comprehensible instead of immersion, where all they heard was brrr. Uh, so I spent, before I even became a teacher, I spent years in the library looking up how, I'm a nerd, so how does one learn a second language? Or I found out you acquire it. And so I was equipped with that right off the bat. So I first started teaching French. So I never really struggled with trying to stay in the target language. I think it just took me a while to be in touch with my students and realize whether it was comprehensible or not and whether they were catching it. So I think for me, the journey was, how can I make this comprehensible? So I spent most of my career trying to find resources. It's really I think two things really surprised me when I was a new teacher. One was administrators are never in my classroom. Why not? That was the first surprise. And the second surprise was I have to get these guys from OLA to holding a conversation with me, but I don't have the resources. I mean, that was such a shock. They expect me to complete this task to bring students to proficiency, but they don't give me the tools that I need. So that's why I started creating all of the resources so that I'd have all the visuals and all of the tools so students can understand. I mean, you can't just get up in front of a class and start talking like a history teacher because they don't speak the language that you speak. So you don't just teach, correct, and go home. Like most teachers, you have to spend an eternity, just tons and tons of time creating resources so that you can talk to students and they'll understand you. So I was a 12-hour-a-day teacher.
I think a lot of teachers can relate to that too. I know I was like that my first 2 years teaching, and I was doing that in a really ineffective method because I wasn't aware that there was a better way to do teaching a language than the one that I was shown by most of the language teaching that I had experienced, right? And I'm sure that you probably had something similar. Like most teachers don't see a 90% or even immersion style classroom before they go into the classroom. And so we don't really have a lot of models out there as to what it looks like, and we have to figure it out ourselves often. And then there's also the huge resource gap. And so I think a lot of people can relate to that. I've got to do a lot of this work on my own, trying to figure out how I'm going to do this and what I'm going to use in order to get there. So how did you get over that hump in your career of figuring out how you were going to do all of this huge task of trying to get students to proficiency and figuring out how students were going to understand what you were saying with all these other things you got to do as a teacher too?
That's interesting. I never thought about what you just said about how I had never observed that before having to do it. I just worked, I was a workaholic. I just, they need visuals. I need to create PowerPoints with visuals. So I would spend a month on one PowerPoint, one vocabulary PowerPoint, because really it takes forever to find just the right visual. And I mean, in order to have the visual be engaging, it has to be artistic, but it also has to convey exactly what you want. I mean, if they look at that, do they see mother? And I've even tested my PowerPoints out on non-speakers, the speakers that they don't speak a word of Spanish or French. And okay, what's that? Nurse. What's that? Hairdresser. So and most of the time, the visual that I chose represents the word that I want them to see. So I mean, I worked. I guess what I want is other teachers not to have to do that, not to have to work 12-hour days to come up with the resources. I want them to go, okay, I have to teach students how to describe clothing. So here's this perfect PowerPoint that Angie spent a month on, and I only have to pay $4 for it. So what's my time worth? So I want other teachers to be able to teach, correct, and go home, because I didn't get to. See these bags? That's 12-hour days for 31 years, So it was just working. And then videos. I don't want to talk about that now because I'm going to talk about it later and I don't want to repeat myself. But when I first started teaching, there were no videos. And really, there really aren't, except for Senor Woolley, there aren't any videos for younger learners. And his are not native speakers. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. It helps. I mean, that's where a lot of the teachers actually fill in that gap, is usually people are filling it in themselves, or they're going to an expert like you in order to find the resources that they need, right? So in your classroom, what does using that resource usually look like? Like, can you tell us about what some of those daily routines are? How do you interact with students using those resources? Like, how do you get people to engage with them with structure? How can other teachers do that too?
Okay, so are you asking me what does my daily structure look like?
Yeah, what does your daily structure look like with all those resources that you talked about?
With the resources. Okay, well, I have daily structure and I do the same thing every day so that students know what I'm saying. That's one of the ways that I get to the target language. It's
That's a really good idea.
So the first thing I do is bell work. They know that. And that usually has, well, not usually, but often it has visuals on it. Describe this visual or answer the question. And then we go over the homework, and I put all the answers on the overhead. And then I teach, check for understanding, practice, and do the closure. But for let's say I want pick a topic, and then I'll tell you what resources I use.
Right now, I'm teaching with my French ones. We're learning about activities and how to invite somebody to go somewhere.
So, really? To invite someone to go somewhere.
Like doing things with your friends and like places around town and activities to do.
Okay, so places. So I have I would show the places PowerPoint, and it has beautiful photographs. So that's a bank, and that's a theater, and I would have them repeat after me, and then I would have it in context. I'd have it in a sentence. I'm trying to remember. And then after 6 or 7 slides, I check for understanding. ¿Es un banco o es una iglesia? And then maybe in context, ¿a dónde vas para comer? And then they answer, but they're answering it. There's a picture up there, ¿a dónde vas? I'm trying to remember that. Yeah. So, right, in that PowerPoint, there are a lot of questions. So 6 or 7 slides, check for understanding. 6 or 7 slides, check for understanding, all with photographs. ¿A dónde vas para estudiar? And then they'll have a little practice, maybe an interactive notebook, activity. I love those because they're hands-on. I don't want students just passively looking at the PowerPoint. I want them interacting in some way. So we do a few. They use their whiteboards for the check for understanding. They work on their interactive notebook, and then maybe we'll do a practice, and then a competition at the end. ¿A dónde vas? And then I want to give them a lot of input before I have them produce. So they probably wouldn't produce for a couple days. I wouldn't do the paired activity until maybe I'll do a little TPR story after that with someone who's going places. And then maybe a video after that. I don't have a video on places, but And I always end with some kind of competition. I don't know if I answered your question about
Yeah,
how,
no.
how I use. I'm just uh, yeah, I use a lot of PowerPoints for visuals, and TPR. We acted out like we'd act out a bank and um, church and school. Um, so
It sounds like fun. It sounds like you have like a really good order that you have with your students. When you first started working with more target language, what was a fear that you had going into the classroom, and what was something that helped you get over that?
I actually didn't have any fears at first. I was a very arrogant little snot when I started teaching. I thought I knew it all. Seriously, because like I told you, I'm a nerd, and um, I had done all of that. By the time I got to the methods class, I could have taught it. You know, it's like, why am I taking this class? I already did all this research.
Mm.
And so it really took me a while to get humbled and realize it takes your whole career to learn how to be a good teacher and how to engage students. But I knew I had the knowledge that if I use English, I'm making it harder for them, not easier.
Good.
Yeah, because the highest level, highest skill level is translation. So if I make them go back and forth from Spanish to English or French to English, that's a skill I don't even have. I want to keep them in one track, thinking in one language at a time. I can't think in two languages at a time. If I'm speaking in this language and I have to say something in this language, I have to I have to change channels. So that knowledge made it easy for me to stay in the target language. When I was a new teacher, first 5 years maybe, I kind of buckled under the pressure of my colleagues and
Mm.
students to speak English while giving instructions. I went, okay, I'll try it. Because for most of my career, I was the only comprehensible input teacher and the only one speaking 90 to 100%. And in the later years, more did, but in the beginning, I was all by myself, and so I got a lot of pressure. So I tried it, and I found out students didn't do any better when I gave the instructions in English, because it doesn't matter what language you speak; they're not listening. They will watch what you do, but they don't hear. So I model everything. When I'm giving instructions, I use the target language, but I model it. So that, for example, if I want them okay, they're going to work in pairs, and I want them to put their desks together, and I want them to put the paper down or the images up on their desk, and I want, the whole thing. So I'll just model. I'll put two desks together. I'll sit down, explain it in the target language, and I'll have my partner do what she needs to do. I'll ask the questions. So they're watching and they know exactly what to do. And honestly, because 80% of us are visual, most of us hear instructions, wah, 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 wah. I need to see you do it. So that I don't really struggle with the notion that I need to use the target language. So to me, that's the easiest thing to do for them.
I think that's really important what you said there, that for a long time you were the only person who was actually using a lot of target language in your department, because I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. I know I was for a while probably using some of the most target language in my department. Now that I'm a department of one, I think when administrators come into my classroom, they don't really understand what's going on a lot of the time. So a lot of teachers can relate to that, and buckling to the pressure of other people to change what you know is going on in your classroom, that you can get a lot of conflicting information. What was something that you think really helped when it came to realizing that you needed to model directions? What were specific things that you did? I know you said you modeled everything in terms of directions. What really helped it click for kids? Because I know when I do things like that, there are some times where they look at me and they say things like, why can't you just do this in English? Like, I sometimes get a lot of pushback even from kids to use more English. Did you ever experience something like that?
I did at first. Not really very much. And I actually have a blog post where I write specifically about how do you handle student resistance. And the reason I don't have a problem with that is because of how I set it up from the beginning. The only students who complain are students who come from someone else. But again, I start out and I say, okay, you know that we're eventually going to go to all Spanish. And so even in level 2, well, in level 2, if they were all my students, and that has happened, then I start with all Spanish. But most of the time I have my students and other students. So I have to treat the level 2 students the same way I treat the level 1 students. Except for I start after 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and then I go to all Spanish. I mean, I'm 100%. So I just tell them from the beginning, I set up the expectation. I say, okay, we are going to speak all Spanish or all French. I just want you to know that eventually, but I won't do it till you're ready. So then they relax. They don't realize that I think they're ready way before they think they're ready. And I don't tell them when we're going to do it. I say, okay, but I won't do it till you're ready, but we're going to go to all Spanish. I just want you to know that. So I want you to guess what I'm saying. So every once in a while I'll stop and I'll say, okay, who can tell me what I said? And I want you to guess. I don't care if you're right or not. So I basically set up an environment where it's okay to guess, where it's okay to make mistakes. And then when they guess, I give them a point. It doesn't matter. Oh, well, good try. Anybody else? Good try. That's what I said. And if nobody gets it,
I'm going to start doing that.
Well, I do that the first maybe 3 weeks in level 1. So I would keep practicing. And I tell them, so someone asks me a question, I say, and I'll answer the question. I say, now remember, and I keep telling this, remember, we're going to go to all Spanish. Think, how could you have said that in Spanish? How could you have said that in French? And I tell them how they could say it. And I just keep doing that so they're prepared. And I give them tools like, now remember, we're going to go to all Spanish. So if you need to say something to me in English, ask me how to say it and I'll give you a point. So I teach them how to say, como se dice? And then if you don't understand me, you need to ask what I said. So, ¿qué quiere decir? And we practice that, and we practice. So I'm basically practicing with them so they have the tools to function in the target language. So then I say, okay, you guys are doing great. See, I spoke Spanish or French almost the entire period. How many of you understood most of what I said? So, they're starting to gain in confidence. The only time I think students will rebel and say, why can't you just say this in English, is if it's not comprehensible input. All they're hearing is and they don't understand a word you're saying because you don't have the resources to make it comprehensible to them. Or they got an A in Mrs. So-and-so's class and she spoke English all the time. You know what I'm saying? The A doesn't represent really any proficiency whatsoever. It represents that I sat in your class and I took your test, but I can't speak a word. So I mean, you can't do anything about that. But what I do about that in level 2 is, well, first of all, those students are surrounded by other students who are holding conversations with me. And so they're aware. How come I don't know what they know? And so then after we practice the review for about a month, because you have to when you have other people's students, then and your own students who didn't pay attention and somehow slipped through the cracks, then I give them a diagnostic test to see how well you do. And then those who fail, I call home. And the first month of Spanish 2 is a nightmare because I spend a lot of time calling home. But I have to teach in the target language because otherwise I'm failing your kids. I'm failing in my responsibility. And so I tell the parent, well, they took this review test and they failed, so we need to set them up with a tutor. Otherwise, they won't make it. So that's how I do it in level 2. Oh, and I also give points to students whenever they speak Spanish to me. I give points to students whenever they answer a question, whether it's correct or not. So I don't really struggle. Students don't rebel anymore, but I think it's just because of the way I build their confidence over time, and I prepare them. And I just set this expectation that in this classroom, there's no English. This is this is the language we speak in this classroom. So.
Yeah, I'm sure that students really gain a lot from that. And I know that teachers I've gotten a lot of good ideas from that too. I'm going to start doing some of those things. What activity do you think is a real game changer for target language use in your classroom?
Yeah, I can't give you just one. I do know that when I was a new teacher,
go for it.
when I was a new teacher, I was very frustrated that I had a 36-to-1 teacher-student ratio.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, if you have one-on-one communication, you can learn a language. I tutored a guy 10 minutes a day for 2 years in French, and he became fluent. But these kids have, they don't have enough interaction time. So I just sat down and racked my brain and said, what can I do to multiply my presence in the classroom so they get more interaction? And I came up with this idea, the stations idea, that's actually student driven. It's 8 stations. So you set up like the school, the bank, the gym, 8 different stations. And for about 2 weeks, I would do one station at a time. I'll ask them questions about the stations and they answer. And then for homework, they go home and they answer the questions. And then we review them the next day. And then I choose the top 8 students, and they sit in front of their station. And then I choose students. I group them according to ability, about 2 or 3 at a time, depending on how many are in the class. And they go around and they answer questions. And every time they answer correctly, they get a chip. And every chip is worth a point. And I don't know why they love this. They're speaking for 70 minutes straight in Spanish or French, but they love it. Can we do it again? Can we do it again? And the good thing is that they're hearing the good students answer because they get to repeat. And so they're practicing. And I'm just walking around monitoring. So that's the culminating activity I do at the end of class. But during all the way through, I would say for keeping kids in the target language, it's probably the TPR stories, telling stories, because they love to see how they're going to turn out. And then the question answer and the repetition, they get enough repetition in context. So that's a great resource. And then my favorite comprehensive input resource are videos. Like I said, I have over 30 of them. And, I don't know what it is. You stick a TV screen around your head and all of a sudden they're paying attention. So when I'm telling a story, it's exhausting, right? You're on stage. Who's watching the students while you're doing that? Because you can't do everything. So when they're watching a video, first of all, they're mesmerized, 100% student engagement. So now I can watch them while they're watching the video, right? And the videos are all native speakers, except for me, I'm in a couple of them. And they have subtitles. So if they don't understand what they heard, they can read it. And then I pop in images. So let's say she's saying what yo llevo una chaqueta en el invierno. So in the wintertime, you see, oh, it's snowing, there's snow outside. So little pop-in images that help them understand. And teachers have told me that they speak, even though they speak naturally, that they're speaking at a pace that students understand. So the videos are my favorite tool. Holding real conversations with students. I would say even if I had a bad lesson, the fact that I'm speaking the target language the entire time, that's 90 minutes of exposure to the target language. And so I just hold conversations with them the whole period. So they see this isn't a subject I have to take like it was when I was, in high school. This is a communication tool and lots of question and answer. So.
Yeah, I think it really brings it to life. It makes it really real world skills when you have that conversation with them. That's really powerful. How do you think that you have made activities and lessons a game changer for students so that they can talk to each other? What's a really good activity that gets students to talk with each other?
Yeah, production. Once they do that, you did a pretty good job with your input. And I try not to have them produce until I've given them that ton of input, but probably paired activities and group activities are the best. And I try to put a lot of visuals in my paired activities. And I love the paired activities with the that are games. So let's say I have the answer, but you don't. So I'm going to ask you a question. And if you get it right, you get a point. If you don't get it right, then you don't. So because they love competition, so that spurs them to speak. And then fun paired activities like speed dating and things like that. And I love dice games because because they're looking at the screen and they have they're speaking correctly without trying, because the correct question is up there and the correct answer is up there, and it's just fun. And whenever I assign those, there's a ton of talking in class. So,
you ready for the next one?
Sure.
How do you create student buy-in for an immersion classroom? I know you talked about how you use the system of points to make them really comfortable around the first 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. And what are other strategies that you use? Or is that the main one that you go with?
All of those are important. I also give them a list of essential phrases. Like, I know you're going to have to ask me, can I go to the bathroom? I know you're going to ask me, may I use the sharpener? And so I have a long list that I give them, and we practice those, and then I test them on that, and I tell them, okay, after the test, you can no longer say anything on this page to me in English. And so if they do, I just say, ¿Cómo? No entiendo. Je ne comprends pas. And so they, what? And I'd say, frases útiles. And so after a while, they realize, well, I better keep that on my desk. And the thing is, I think it's really important to realize that it's not the students that you have to train, it's yourself. So because if I am inconsistent and I let them speak to me in English and I respond to them in English, then I'm basically setting myself up for student resistance. Mm-hmm. If I train myself that every time they speak to me in English, I say, no entiendo. ¿Cómo? And then I just keep teaching. Well, what's the consequence? The consequence is that you can't communicate with me. You didn't get your question answered. So if you want to get your question answered, you better figure out how to say it to me in the target language. Mm-hmm. And I talked about the daily routines. The targets. So basically, what I described to you about how I set up the expectation that we're going to go all in the target language, it's kind of like a frog in water, So really, it's like, oh, it's warm and comfortable in here, and it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and pretty soon, it's too hot, and the frog gets cooked. They're not going to get cooked, but it's kind of like that. It's like, so a little bit at a time, and then all of a sudden we're speaking in the target language, and they're not even aware that it happened. So that's how I get student buy-in. It's just the gradual. Well, it's not that gradual, but just the system that I use. And then when I do the targets, the beginning of every classroom, I start off and I say, well, today we're going to learn. So hoy vamos a aprender, bla, bla, bla. Hoy vamos a estudiar y tal y tal y tal. Y después ustedes van a bla, bla, bla. O luego ustedes van a. So I do that in Spanish 1 for about a month, and with the English under it. That's what I was talking about, the routines. Mm-hmm. And I make them repeat after me. Hoy vamos a. And then after a month, I just take them off. They're so used to it that now it's all in Spanish, and it's like, the frog in water. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm afraid I'll forget to say this later, so I'm going to say it now. That's one of the strategies I use to stay in the target language. You can't stay in the target language unless students are listening to you. Mm-hmm. So for me, instructional strategies and classroom management strategies, that's number one. I mean, if a teacher tells me, I just can't teach in the target language, I'm like, well, how's your classroom management? How are your instructional strategies? So I start off and I say, okay, this is what we're gonna learn, and then this is what you're gonna do. So at the very beginning, they know, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to give a presentation. I better pay attention. Oh my gosh, there's gonna be competition. I'm gonna look really stupid if I don't know what I'm doing. So immediately they're like, okay, I'm with you. And so if they're listening, they're going to be acquiring. But if you don't have their attention, then they're not going to be acquiring. So did I answer your question?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, you hook them right from the beginning, knowing what their task is going to be. And so set us up with the first week of class. And you talked about some of your beginning procedures of what you do. What does the first week look like exactly for how you set up that target language environment? You talked a lot about how important it is for students to feel safe and comfortable, where they feel like they can make mistakes and guess. How do you set up that environment so well, and something that maybe other teachers can use too?
That's the first 2 weeks, I think, are the most important. And like I said, classroom management. And I spend 2 or 3 weeks on classroom management, especially in level 1, because if they're not listening, then they're not going to acquire. Mm-hmm. And I'm up there doing a song and dance, and every time I call them, I'm interrupting their social time. So I spend an enormous amount of time teaching not only the classroom rules, but the classroom procedures. This is how you turn in your homework. This is how you speak. If you want to speak, you raise your hand. We practice when they raise their hand and when they answer in chorus. And they know what todos means everybody, and or this son or whatever. I can't remember what I did. 3 years was an eternity. But so we practice those things. And I would say 90% of what I know in classroom management, for classroom management strategies, I learned from Fred Jones. And so if any teacher is struggling with classroom management, I highly recommend Fred Jones Tools for Teaching workshops. I have either attended or facilitated 15 times because there's so much to learn. But you set your classroom up so that you have an environment that enables you to teach, enables students to learn, then that's a huge hurdle that you don't need to worry about anymore. So I learned proximity from him. The tension part I learned from him. Teaching in little chunks. I mean, after 5 minutes, most of us hear wah, 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 input, output, input, output. I teach you 5 or 10 minutes at the most, and then you do something with it. Mm-hmm. So I have a word wall. Mm-hmm. I try to set students up with they call it text-rich environment, So all the high-frequency words are around the classroom, and the question words around the classroom, so they have quick reference to them. I teach the commands first thing, because I want to go eventually. I tell them, well, I'm going to be telling you what to do. I'm going to be giving you all the instructions in Spanish or in French. If you don't understand what I'm saying, you won't know what to do, right? So we're going to practice the commands. So the first 2 or 3 weeks, we're doing commands, but it's fun. I'll do 7 or 10 at the most, and then we'll have a competition. First we'll all do them together, and then we'll see who can do them faster, side A or side B. And then when they get better, we do individual. I'll call a number and see which one of those can obey faster. So basically, and then after we've done this 2 or 3 weeks, then after that, I said, well, the commands. So now from now on, whenever I tell you what to do, it's going to be in the target language. And then this is not the first week, but this is one of my favorite strategies for staying in the target language. I do this in semester 2 in Spanish 1, but in Spanish 2, 3, and 4, I do it almost immediately, like after the first 3 weeks, where I'll write Inglés or Anglais, you've heard this, right, on the board, and then every time I hear them speak English, I'll erase a letter. And then if they have any letters left, they get an extra point on the next quiz. And so they could get up to 3 or 4 extra points. So they're highly motivated. So this helps a lot.
That's a great idea. I haven't heard of it done before where you give them bonus points. Oh, my kids would eat that up. I'm gonna have to steal that.
It really works. It even with level 1. But like I said, I don't want them to get too frustrated. So they're not quite ready for that until semester 2 in level 1.
My French 2s, we could do that next week though. That's a great idea. I'm gonna try it.
I tried the bean thing. That didn't work so well.
I've tried the bean one before. Yeah, it didn't work well for me. I feel like it works well with younger students.
Oh, interesting.
But high school, I don't know. They're not into it. In my experience, they haven't been into it.
Yeah, they weren't into it. And also I was surprised that they were too nice. They didn't want to take anybody's bean.
Ugh, little angels.
Yeah, it's like, no, you're my friend.
Little angels. What does your class look like in the middle of the year? Like right now we're in February. What does your class look like in February? Like really in the thick of things?
That's when I really enjoy teaching because the class is running itself. It's like a well-oiled machine. I cannot be there. It still run itself. I mean, I think the first 3 weeks of teaching are so stressful because you have to do everything. Your students aren't trained yet on the procedures. You don't have TAs yet. If you do have TAs, you haven't trained them. So you're just like, oh, juggling all these balls, you know. But in the middle of the year, the TAs are trained. They hand out all the raffle tickets. Oh, forgot to tell you about the raffle tickets.
Ooh, what's the raffle tickets?
Well, I'll tell you. Let me finish the question. They hand out all the raffle tickets. Students are walking in and working right away. They're holding conversations with me. They know the routines. They put their homework in the homework basket. You know, so that's what it looks like. But one of my we were talking about how to keep them in the target language, and they can't be in the target language if they can't hear you, and they can't hear you if they're all talking. So this is a strategy that I love, and it really works most of the time, is incentive, where they come in and either a TA, or if you don't have a TA, another student whose job it is. That's another thing, is in the middle of the year, the students know what their jobs are. You know, some kids pass out papers, some kids return homework. So basically, you know, everything's running smoothly. People know where to students know where to pick up homework if they were absent. But anyway, so they come in. If they're sitting quietly, they're not talking, and they're writing because the bell works on the screen, then they get a ticket. And then on Friday, I have this box, and I have things from Teachers Discovery. They have incentives and pens, pencils, really cute things. They love the bracelets. I don't know why. And then I always put in homework passes and candy bars, chocolate. They love the chocolate, the big ones, the little ones. So then I'll shake it up. At the end of class, they put their little tickets in the jar, and then I shake it up and I pull 4 names, and they get a goodie. So that keeps them coming in and working immediately. So
that is a nice incentive. I like that idea. That's a fun one.
Yeah.
Could you recommend, what do you think is something that teachers could use tomorrow in class, something that they could start with right away, no matter what level of target language that they're using, that could help bring up their level that they have?
The raffle tickets. Yeah.
Yeah? That's a good one.
Yeah, the raffle tickets. And probably the tension in the lesson. Today we're going to do this, and then you're going to do this.
How can teachers build up more target language use if they want to reach for more than where they are now? Like, I know a goal of mine all year has been to use more target language, and I know I'm not quite where I need to be. How do you think teachers can level up their target language use?
I think the important thing is to plan, and have all your visuals ready. Like I said before, we need the resources. And so you have to look at what is it you want your students to be able to do today, and will they have the tools to do it? will they be able to understand you? If not, how are you going to make them understand you? So make sure you have all your visuals in line. When I look at my lesson plans, oh, they're not going to understand that. You know, do I have a visual to help them understand that? Have visuals in your PowerPoints, have your stories ready, have your videos ready. And don't, a mistake that I made as a novice teacher, which was, I guess I was a novice for many, many years, is to assign something and not give students the vocabulary they needed to do the task. So I want them to ask each other questions, but they don't know how to react. So I have to give them those no me digas, oh, estoy de acuerdo, you know, things like that. And I know some teachers are really surprised and indignant that their students would use Google Translate. Well, ask yourself, did they have all of the foundational vocabulary they needed to do that task? And if not, you can expect them to use Google Translate because they want to succeed. So if you don't want them to use Google Translate, then make sure that they have the vocabulary they need. For instance, when I gave my AP students, now these are AP students, a task to find a recipe from a Spanish-speaking country, prepare it, and explain to the class how you prepared it, and then we get to eat it. But, you know, I'm not a native speaker, and I wasn't raised in a Spanish-speaking country. And even though I lived in Mexico and in Spain, I did very little cooking. So my knowledge of spices and many foods and utensils is minimal. So I made a huge long list, and verbs. How do you say to stir up, and how do you say to bake, and all those things they need? There's no way they could have done this assignment without a huge bank of verbs and vocabulary. Otherwise, they'd all be using Google Translate. So make sure that just you have to be prepared. Writing a lesson plan can take hours and hours and hours.
What can language teachers do to make everything more comprehensible to students? Because you mentioned that sometimes there are some gaps. So what can teachers do to make sure that their language that they're using is comprehensible?
I'm probably going to repeat myself, but probably just model everything. Make sure you have your visuals, high frequency words, illustrate everything. Not all my stories are illustrated, but the ones that are work really, really well. It's like I'll be telling the story and they'll be following along in the illustrations. Use realia and objects. When you're teaching food, have objects of food. I use plastic food. When I teach the clothing, I go down all the list of what do I want them to know, and I have this huge suitcase, and I put all of them in there, and I pull them out, and I talk about them. Draw on the board, you know, do whatever it takes to get students to understand, and of course have visuals. I think in videos, yeah, you got to have those videos. Yeah, I think I pretty much touched on all these things before. Mainly, you have to be prepared. And I think, like I said, when I was a new teacher, I was not prepared for how time consuming it was going to be. And I was a little mad because before I became a teacher, I was trying to decide what to do with my life. And so, you know, I have these languages. What do? Well, I could be a flight attendant or I could be a teacher. Turns out, you know, teaching uses all of my talents, and what I was doing before used none of them. So I was very bored because I used to be an illustrator. But I didn't want to be a flight attendant because I didn't want to be in different countries alone by myself in hotels. And so I talked to teachers and I interviewed them, and not one of them said this is really time consuming. So I think that was a huge shock to me. It's like, I don't have a life, you know? So, I mean, if you really want your students to understand what you're saying, you have to have those resources. So.
Very true. What are some things that you use to make yourself a better teacher? I know you talked about using Ron Jones. What are some other things that you like? Do you have any book recommendations or podcasts or conferences that you like to go to?
Actville, we had one, I loved Actville. We had flags in Sacramento that I used to go to, and read. I'm reading a book now in Spanish. In fact, I wrote a blog post on how to stay fluent recently. So if you want to go to best PowerPoints for SpanishClass.com, and that's the last blog post I wrote. It says, I think the best thing you can do to be a teacher, the best teacher you can be, is to keep fluent, especially if you're a native speaker. Great, you don't have to work on that, but I never was. So I mean, I have to. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. And so I mean, I took Italian for a year, and all I remember is mangia because I don't use it anymore. So so keep yourself fluent. I've talked to people on I can't remember the name of it. I wish I could, because it's a really good service. There's two of them. Talk Abroad is one of them. And there's another one where you pay a very small fee and you can speak to native speakers and practice that way. And I have a native speaker friend, and I visit with her. I just love her, and we speak in Spanish. And also, I'm in many Facebook groups and many Instagram groups. I've learned so much by collaborating with other teachers. We're so isolated in our classroom, and I can't believe I used to think, well, I know it, and you guys don't know anything. And we started doing PLCs in my school, and I went, wow, that's a really good idea. I never thought of that. You know, you get so many ideas from other people. And I mean, I learned from a Facebook group about interactive notebooks and interactive notebook activities, and that totally revolutionized my student learning. So
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love learning from other teachers. That's my favorite place to go to. That's why I like doing things like this. I've already learned a lot. What do you do on difficult days, like, hard days, to maintain your target language?
You know, I don't have trouble maintaining the target language. I have trouble covering the material. So, you know, when you say difficult days, I think, okay, this is the second fire drill this month. I mean, we'd have them every 2 weeks, whether we needed them or not. Someone was smoking in the bathroom, or, you know, homecoming, or, oh my gosh, you've never seen rain before. We all have to go to the window and look at the rain. You know? Yeah. So you just change the homework and teach it tomorrow, and go with the flow, and turn it into something, a teachable moment. Like, oh, pues está granizando, sí, o llueve mucho en febrero, no? And, you know, just roll with it.
Yeah, roll with it. That's the nice part about using lots of target language, right? You can make anything still relevant when you're giving them lots and lots of input. How do you handle any type of tricky classroom management situation when you're in that thick of it, working in 100% target language?
Yeah, you know, that's a very good question, because it's really hard unless you have this wonderful Jerry Seinfeld personality where kids just love you and you're funny, but I'm not very funny. So students know right from the beginning, when I first taught them the rules, they know tienes un aviso, you have a warning, tienes detención. They know that if you do this, this is the consequence. So I don't get much pushback on that. What I started to say was that it's hard to keep the relationship, you know, and then when you're handing down consequences in the target language, it can get a little icy. But most of the time there isn't a problem, and they even understand, you know, go to the office. But if it's really egregious, I will just, you know, keep teaching, because the students are used to me walking around the classroom. I never stay in the same spot. I mean, unless I'm, you know, formally teaching up front. So I'll just walk to the offender and stand by him or her, whisper in the ear in Spanish or English, French or English, depends on the moment. But they usually understand go to the other room or go outside or talk to me after class. So I'll just say, well, go in the other room or go outside, and then get my students working on something, and then I'll go talk to them in private, and then we'll have a conversation. And the reason that I do that is twofold. First of all, I want to maintain the integrity of the all Spanish, all target language, all French in this classroom. So I'm not going to have that conversation in English in this classroom. And secondly, it needs to be private. So I don't want anybody else to know what's going on. This is between the student and me. I don't want to embarrass the student. If I want to have a whole class against me, I will definitely come down on the student publicly. So that's how I handle that.
Yeah, I think that's a good universal strategy. Any subject, it's always got to be private, right?
Yeah, I haven't honestly always done that, and so I've suffered the consequences.
How do you handle when things flop and students are really lost in translation?
I didn't quite understand that question.
So when you have a moment where you're really getting into the flow of doing things and you can just tell that your students are lost. They don't know what's going on or what you're saying, what they're supposed to do, when basically the target language fails.
90% of the time, I will try another method. I'll say it in a different way. I will act it out. I will draw on the board. I'll do whatever I can to get them to understand. I'll use cognates. If none of that works, let's say it's a difficult grammar concept, for 2 minutes, I'll go to English. But that's rare. That hardly ever happens. The only time I go to English, and I have found that this is the only time, the only thing that students cannot understand, actually 2 times. When I'm teaching the direct and indirect object pronouns, I realize that they will not understand me because they don't understand English grammar. So I spend about a week teaching them English grammar. And then I show them the difference between the English and the Spanish grammar. And then I teach them their pronouns all in Spanish. And then imperfect and preterite, they struggle. So I'll spend a little bit of time in English. Apart from that, I haven't found any time that students couldn't understand me. So except for those 2 grammar areas, if they didn't get what I was saying, I would just say it slower or repeat it many times or act it out. Or like I said, I'll do anything I can to get them to understand me, and usually that works. So.
That's a good strategy. And how do you design your curriculum with target language use in mind?
I think, okay, what is it that I want them to be able to do? And again, plan. And what visuals am I going to need so that they will understand what I'm saying? And I'm going to direct, instruct, and then what resources am I going to use so to give them enough repetition and context? And a lot of times, this is an area where, I mean, if my students aren't producing, I'm like, how can you not be producing it? Well, obviously I haven't given you enough repetition and context because you're not able to produce yet. So I think we have to give them way more than we think we have to give them. So we have to plan. Okay, I'm going to teach. I'm not I'm not a purist. I like to blend the conscious mind of learning with the acquisition. So I formally teach, and then I spend the rest of the time cementing it with comprehensible input. So I have things like, let's see, well, this would be a good listening activity where they listen and they draw, or they listen and they respond, or they might want a story. This story might be a good tool for this particular concept, or a video. So that's how I do it.
That's kind of a perfect marriage of both of them. So you have so many great ideas for what teachers can do in order to use their target language. We've got really great structures for what your classes can look like, awesome routines, really great rewards. I'm definitely going to use that one where you write anglais on the board and erase it. I'm definitely going to use that next week. Thank you so much for all of these great ideas. And I know that you have you have a ton of, like, a whole library of blog posts where teachers can find out more about this. Where can teachers find out more about you, Angie?
They can also go to my website, best PowerPoints for Spanish class.com. I have a YouTube channel as well. I think that's called Angie Torrey.
Mm-hmm.
I have a Facebook group that's Best PowerPoints for Spanish and French. Oh, but probably Instagram is where I show most about who I am as a person. I post frequently about my workouts. It's really important for me to stay in shape. So Instagram is Best PowerPoints for Spanish, I think. So if they want to know more about me personally, you want to see my good workouts.
Yeah, I post some of my workout stuff on Instagram too. It's always a fun place to go. We'll make sure that we link to all of those blog posts where teachers can find out more specifically about target language, and they can find you on all of the places all over the internet to find out more about you. And thank you so much for joining me so that we can learn more about target language and benefit from all of your expertise. Thank you so,
Thanks
so,
for
so
having
much.
me. Thanks for having me.